of Socrates and his questioning of the slave boy that we finished about a year or two ago. Now, the participants in the study were Harvard undergraduates and also 5 to 7-year-old American children, and a third group, adults and adolescents from a remote Amazonian tribe, about 2 weeks boat ride upriver from the nearest city in the Amazon, called the Munduruku. And we were interested in these people because, like Mino's slave, they had no formal education. But unlike the slave, they also shared no language or immediately accessible culture with us. They live in a very, very different culture. They have very limited words for numbers, for example, and for spatial relationships and so forth. So they seem like an interesting contrast case to look at to try to see what's universal in our geometrical intuitions and what's variable. Now, we performed 2 tasks with them. Both tasks were done on a laptop computer, and both of them started by presenting an image of a Euclidean plane. I hope you can see it's like a textured surface over on the left. And then presenting pictures of points or lines. The lines were described as paths that were very straight. The place was described as a space that was perfectly flat and very large and just went on in all directions. The lines were described as paths that were very straight, that connected villages to one another, and the points were described as villages that were said to be very small, and the paths went right through the center of the villages. And after that introduction, people were then shown 2 points, told those were 2 villages, and the beginnings of 2 yellow paths that they were told were the beginnings of a single path that connected those 2 villages, and then 2 other paths that they were told were paths that went to the same third village. And the question we asked is where is that third village, and what do those 2 paths, those 2 green paths, look like at the point where they meet that third village? And to answer that second question, we gave them a device they could use to make that third angle. Okay? So we're asking people to construct the third angle of a triangle given information about the first 2 points and angles. Now, just to make things fun, we also gave people a second task where the questions were exactly the same except for one thing. Instead of describing the land that these villages and paths were on as planar, we described it as spherical. Okay? Now, the interesting thing is that the location and the angle of that third point are different on the plane than they are on the sphere. On the plane, as you all know, the 3 angles of a triangle sum to a constant. 2 right angles are 180 degrees. So it doesn't matter how far apart those 2 yellow points are. That third angle is only going to depend on the sizes of the other 2 angles. But on the sphere, the sum of the 3 internal angles of a triangle is not a constant. It's always larger than 180 degrees. And how much larger depends on the size of the triangle. So as you move those 2 villages further apart, holding the angles constant, the size of that third angle is going to grow. So to see if people were sensitive to these properties of the plane and of the sphere, we took their individual angle measures, added them to the 2 visible angles of the triangle, and asked what the sum was. How close was it to 180 degrees, and was it independent of triangle size in the planar case, and was it more than 180 degrees and growing with triangle size in the spherical case? So is the study clear? Here are the findings from the Harvard students. First of all, if you look just at the blue lines, those are the data from the planar case. We're arraying them as the sum of the 3 angles, the one they produce plus the other 2, as a function of the size, I'm sorry, my pointer isn't working, the size of the triangle, bigger triangles on the right. And if you look just at the blue points, you see they're very close to the blue line, which would be perfect performance. So the Harvard students are doing very well at deducing that third angle from the other 2 angles. If you turn now to the red line, you see what perfect performance would have been on the sphere. And if you look at the red points, what you see is that people are not perfect spherical geometers by any means, but they are adjusting their estimates in the appropriate direction. producing larger angles for larger triangles as they should. And that's a reliable effect. Now we can ask, where are these two effects coming from? Are they coming from instruction in geometry? If they were, then the Munduruku in the Amazon should show a very different pattern of performance. But in fact, they show extremely similar performance. They look an awful lot like the Harvard students. So the development of at least this aspect of Euclidean geometry does not seem to depend on formal education or on having a big vocabulary of number words and spatial terms and so forth. So at this point, Plato should be happy, except I think he might be less happy with our last piece of data, which comes from the U.S. children. Now, these 5 to 7-year-old children look really different, either from the U.S. adults or from the Amazonian adults. First of all, there's basically no difference at all between the judgments they give on the plane and the judgments they give on the sphere. But second, if you look just at the planar judgments, they're all wrong. They don't seem to appreciate that that third angle of the triangle is going to depend on the other two angles. Instead, if you look more closely at their data, what they seem to be following is a general erroneous rule that says larger triangles should have larger angles. So no matter what the sizes of those angles are, if we move those points apart to a greater distance, we should end up with a greater angle in the end. And that rule seems to underlie their performance both on the sphere and on the plane. So the conclusion is that the development of this aspect of Euclidean intuitions doesn't seem to depend on education, but you don't get it for free either over the course of human development. The young children don't seem to share it. Well, maybe you could think this is kind of a complicated task. Maybe they're not good at manipulating that machine that you use to judge angles. What if we just ask simple yes-no questions? So here's our second experiment. We start with the same setup. You've either got a planar world or a spherical world. But then, in both cases, whether we start with the plane or with the sphere, on the computer screen, we zoom in. So we're looking at just a little piece of the terrain. And what we're looking at now is the same in both the planar and the spherical case. We've zoomed into a single image. And on that image, we either put two lines or a line and a point, and we ask some simple yes-no questions. Here are a few of the questions that we asked. Are these lines going to cross on the right over here? Or are they going to cross on the left? Can you make two lines that never cross that are parallel? Can you make two lines that cross twice? And so forth. A whole set of different yes-no questions. And all I want to give you is the overall picture of how people responded in these three groups. First of all, how they did in the planar case and how they did in the spherical case. But second, you'll notice that some of these questions get the same answer on the plane and the sphere. That's true for the first question up there. But some of them, including all three of the subsequent questions up there, get different answers on the plane and the sphere. So let's look separately at how people do both when the two answers are the same and when they're different. So first of all, for U.S. adults, what we're plotting here is the proportion of planar responses. Okay? So perfect performance would be very high here, here, and here, and all the way down to the floor here, which is the spherical case where the planar response is wrong. Okay? And what you see, as in the first study, is that adults are very good at the planar case, and they are adjusting in the appropriate direction, though not perfectly, in the spherical case. What about the Amazonian adults? Same general picture. And what about the children? They look different. No differentiation between the plane and the sphere. And while they've got a few of these properties right, they're getting most of them wrong. Okay? So to summarize where I think this study takes us, it looks like knowledge of abstract Euclidean geometry can indeed develop without any formal instruction in geometry, just like Plato told us it should. But it develops very slowly in children. And at the start of children's formal instruction, they still haven't really taken the decisive steps into this territory, right? They're just at the point of beginning to work out what these relationships are. And so that raises the question, how does natural geometry become natural to us? And I want to spend the rest of my time addressing that question. So here are assumptions that I think are broadly shared in cognitive science and very useful for trying to approach any question about the development of knowledge like this one. So formal geometry, 2,000 years seems like a long time when you're a young field like cognitive science that's only existed for 50 years or so. But when you think on a scale of, on an evolutionary time scale, a time scale over which our basic capacities, cognitive capacities, and biological capacities would have developed, this is really short, a blink of an eye, right? I think it follows that we likely didn't evolve any basic foundational cognitive systems specifically for the purpose of making intuitions, of developing intuitions about dimensionless points and infinitely long lines and so forth. Now, if that's true, what it must mean is that when we learn geometry as children and when we practice it as adults, what we must be doing is taking properties of the mind and brain that evolved to serve other purposes and harnessing them for this new purpose, right? Those capacities may be organized into systems with properties that we can study. If that's right, then to discover those systems, I think we can make headway through a four-pronged set of comparative enterprises. So one enterprise is to look across evolutionary timescales at creatures whose most recent common ancestor was varying temporal distances apart from us. We can do this by comparing the cognitive capacities of humans like that child to those of other primates or other more distant mammals or birds or even insects. Second, we can make comparisons across the time scale of human development, comparing the capacities of infants to those of children to adults, asking what's constant over development and what's varying. Third is we can make comparisons across cultures and also across humans with different cognitive capacities and systematically varying kinds of experience like deafness, which we already heard a little bit about, asking how development varies under different conditions of experience and with different conditions of affecting basic biological mechanisms. And finally, we can look at, we can make comparisons across different levels of analysis, from genes to neurons to brain systems to computation. And this is a shout out to all of the people who talked about how interdisciplinary cognitive science is. Here's a question that's proprietary to cognitive science that can be addressed by research that spans a vast array of disciplines, focusing always, though, on a comparative approach where work from one discipline can shed light on questions you have that arise from another discipline. Now, in general overview, I think that research that takes these four comparative approaches suggests that our knowledge of geometry is founded on at least two core systems that we humans share with other animals. One is a system for representing aspects of the shape of the large-scale layout that we navigate through, and doing so for purposes of answering basic questions like, where am I, and what direction do I want to move in order to arrive at some other significant place in the environment that I've encountered in the past. And the second is a system that we apply to small-scale, generally movable objects for analyzing the shapes of those objects and using the results of those analyses to answer basic questions like, what is this thing that I'm confronting now? If it's an animal, what kind of an animal is it? If it's a natural object, what kind of an object, a food object, and so forth. The hypothesis that I think this research supports, and this is a hypothesis that I will not be presenting to you as a firm conclusion. This is because this is one of the, addresses one of these questions that's still outstanding. But the hypothesis is that we take the results of these core systems that I think we have discovered and combine them productively to arrive at the intuitions of Euclidean geometry. And moreover, I think the work on the Munduruku and on children suggests that these combinations may depend critically on two kinds of symbol systems. One is natural language, and the other is the class of visual spatial symbols like pictures and maps that we use to represent our experience, both of the objects that we manipulate and of the navigable world. Okay, so that's where I'm going. Let me start by introducing you to